Now, before I even summarize our pillars, before I get into anything, I'd like to clash with our opponents. So their entire case is based on this idea of deterrence, this idea of mutually assured destruction. And what we've brought out over and over is that it doesn't work in an unstable country where you have radical civilians such as terrorists. And they've counterclassed us and said there's terrorists everywhere. But as we've seen over and over, as we've seen used common sense to figure out when we watch the news, is that it's more prevalent in these areas, in these regions. And what we've noticed is that not only is Iran's region, not only is it unstable, but it is harboring civilians that do have these ideas where mass destruction does take place. Now, they've also brought up this idea where we can help them. We can help them to protect their own nuclear weapons. Now, we asked them that if they aren't even telling us whether or not they're making nuclear weapons right now, why would they let you into their country to help them protect their own nuclear weapons? They don't allow this transparency. They haven't allowed it before. What makes you think they'll allow it now? Then they brought up this other idea we've brought in, where if Iran's reason is the fear of Israel, we've said that China and Russia, their ties with them can help protect them. And then they stood up and they've counterclassed that and said that, well, why shouldn't we allow Iran to be independent? Well, if we want Iran to be independent, why are we helping them take care of nuclear weapons that they can't support themselves? Now, moving on to clash with their pillars themselves, they've talked about self-interest. And they've talked about how they're making the assumption that Iran itself as a whole country has this interest to protect themselves. But once again, this is assuming that every civilian, the government and the civilians share this self-interest. Then they've said that the West shouldn't fear Iran because we have the power to make economic sanctions, we have our own military power. Once again, Iran is unstable, the government does not have what it takes to protect suicidal terrorists from taking action. And if terrorists are suicidal and don't even fear themselves being killed, why do they care about anything else? And now, once again, the deterrence and the fear idea, which I've already clashed. Now, moving on to our pillars. Our first pillar talked about this.
Well, don't you also understand that the United States has also withheld terrorists from getting nuclear weapons in places like Pakistan?
Now, Pakistan has not signed on to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. They may have used America's help, but they're not internationally recognized to be allowed to hold nuclear weapons. So that is not the topic of discussion right now. Although what we're discussing right now is whether or not that is to be feared, and because America has helped them, clearly it is to be feared. Now, our first pillar talked about the unstable government, then we talked about the terrorists in the region. Now, in our third pillar, we're going to zoom out and we're going to just use common sense and see that nuclear weapons are to be treated with caution just in general. And our case line has pointed out that to you over and over, that nuclear weapons are to be feared. And I will give you examples of this. I will elaborate on this over and over. So, not only can Iran not hold this nuclear weapons in general are to be feared. So, we've seen examples of this. The first example is when we use nuclear weapons themselves, when America used them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I cannot find one person who can say that this is a good thing. They may say it was necessary, they may say that this is what they needed, but no one will say that it was a good thing, that the people deserve to die, that innocent people deserve the aftermath of what took place.
And don't you believe it could have been stopped if, for example, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had nuclear capability?
No, I do not believe this, because once again, you are running on the fact of mutually assured destruction, which we've seen in examples of the Cold War, where it was on the breaking edge, where it could have happened. And that's what we're saying over and over, that you cannot build weapons of mass destruction and just assume that no one will use them. They're being built so that they can be used as soon as a country is too weak to use their own. Now, so Hiroshima and Nagasaki had terrible, terrible after effects. Then what? Then came the and before that came the Cold War, where the race for ammunition between Russia and America had people completely scared. They were terrified because if hell broke loose, and if they started using these weapons, the world would be destroyed. And now we see that not only are nuclear weapons dangerous, the entire idea of nuclear power itself is dangerous. When we see countries like Japan, first world countries that cannot contain their nuclear weapons, their nuclear power in catastrophes such as the earthquake, and they have massive meltdowns and breakdowns, what we see is that nuclear power itself, in its essence, is dangerous and it should be feared. And that is what our resolution is here today. Not only should it be feared in Iran, it should be feared in general. Now, another example of this before Japan was Chernobyl. The entire aftermath is still being dealt with. So what we can see is that not only is nuclear power dangerous, nuclear weapons are dangerous, and in a third world country where they have other issues to deal with other than just these nuclear weapons and keeping them safe, they need to take into consideration that they have other issues that need to be dealt with at the current time, and these nuclear weapons aren't exactly what they need to be developing at the moment. So what have I told you today? Today my partner and me have brought in 3 pillars. Basically, we've talked about why Iran itself as a whole, as its government, is not stable. We've talked about how they have human rights issues. Their president is clearly just declaring open hatred for other countries. And we've talked about how nuclear weapons are to be feared in an unstable government, where that cannot protect its civilians. Then we've talked about how this region is filled with terrorists, how it's filled with radical civilians that don't even care about their own lives, nonetheless the lives of others. And how can an unstable government protect their civilians and people outside of their country from these terrorists? Then we talked into how nuclear weapons themselves should be treated with caution, and how nuclear power and nuclear weapon in its essence is